Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Scott Parker Goes Live. For those who don't know me, I've been called a covert human rights campaigner. Others, I expect, describe me more as a social entrepreneur and thought leader who invented the first business-owned disability network and has a long career persuading senior executives that treating people properly, including people with disabilities, is good for business, and then showing them how. Some argue that I have supped with the private sector devil so long, with that famous long spoon, that I have in fact gone over to the dark side. Whatever you call me, after some 30 years hacking away at this, I'm still asking the questions that I think really matter. Why is it so hard to get "and what about disability" into the ethical and responsible AI debate? Why do so many of the diversity managers who describe diversity as a choice choose not to tackle disability discrimination? And since when is treating people fairly and with respect defined as a choice? Well, I guess you could argue not robbing a bank is a choice. Why do we have health conditions and it's other people who have disabilities? And why do we just take it for granted that HR practitioners don't have a clue about the impact of disability discrimination on, well, their human resources? I don't know about you, but I expect a doctor to know the difference between your elbow and your knee. And with all that said, let's dive into this episode. So I'm so looking forward to our conversation. I think I have to start by introducing you. Now, Alice Maynard has had a varied career. That's an understatement, Alice, I think. Because, well, of course, when we met, I would also say you've been a social entrepreneur for much of your life. But you've also, starting in IT, you've moved through rail and transport with a scattering of housing, health, social care, and now in government, financial services, and academia. So you're now chair of the University of York, which sounds really interesting. You're a non-executive on the Financial Conduct Authority Board. I'll be intrigued by how many of our listeners know what the Financial Conduct Authority Board actually does, but it does sound important. And you're a member of the government's Commercial Office Remuneration Committee. And of course, I'm also well aware that at one time you were chair of Scope, one of the country's biggest nonprofits. And so until recently, you were on the board of HMRC, the UK's tax people, and Transport for London, which must have a huge impact on how people get around this town. Mm-hmm. So I know you've got this passion for governance. So we agreed we weren't really going to talk about the disability stuff so much as how you enable the kind of governance in large organizations and complex government departments that actually enhances the well-being of everyone who's either working in that organization or impacted by the work that it does. So I'm going to open with this first question because you wanted to talk about governance. When you watch what's happening out there, the word governance comes up all the time, but it's a bit like the word culture. What do you mean by governance? What actually is it in concrete terms? And why does it matter? Or is it just kind of like Jesus saying, you shall be good and get on with it?
So it is a bit muddled, I think, sometimes. And people use it in kind of very narrow ways, and they use it in very wide ways as well. And it's very difficult to grasp. But essentially, it's good governance leads to good decisions taken within the context of your purpose and your strategy as an organization. They can be implemented, these decisions, they can be monitored, and they are understood by everyone involved. And they drive the company in the right direction. And they drive it in the right direction with an ethical approach. And that really is, for me, that's about why we want good governance. I remember when I was chair of Milton Keynes Racial Equality Council, I invited the trustees to participate in a training course about governance. that had been set up by a training company, and we got invited to participate, and I said, please do. And very few of my trustees came along. And at the beginning of the session, she said, so who is on their board because they are passionate about the services and the things that you do as an organisation? And everybody put their hands up. And who is here because they are passionate about governance? And I put my hand up. And I was the only one. So I've been interested in governance and good governance for a long time. And that's because I think organisations fail and do the wrong thing and go down the wrong path when they don't have good governance.
So when you're talking about governance, do you mean what the board does, be of a profit operation or a non-profit? Or do you mean what the chief executive is doing?
I mean what the organisation is doing. Actually, for me, I once wrote a piece that was about governance being like a domestic electricity supply. I know. I know. I did show it to my business consultant at the time, and he said, "Well, maybe a bit less hairdryer." But my point was that the board is like the consumer unit into which the mains electricity comes. That's kind of the external environment, and then there's a whole load of wiring around your home that carries the electricity, and if you plug in your hairdryer, which is where the hairdryers came into, if you plug in your hairdryer into one of your plugs and you switch on the plug and the hairdryer doesn't work, that may well be a problem with your wiring system or your plug or whatever. And that for me is like the front line. So the front line is, can I plug my hairdryer in and get it to work? And then it's, how does that work? So how does the organisation work at the front line is the governance side of it, because that governance streak, that governance process has to go through the whole organisation. If there's something wrong in the middle, then it won't, whatever your organisation is doing on the ground will not work properly.
In many large organizations, the people at the front don't even know who's on the board.
No, and I always think it's useful if they do, but it's not absolutely critical. They don't know, they don't need to know who. It would be better if they did, partly because the board potentially has quite a lot of impact on their lives. For instance, I chair the people committee at the FCA, and the decisions that we make and the discussions that we have influence what happens to our people across the whole organisation, because we set things like remuneration policy and we look at performance of the organisation, and so our performance of the people in the organisation. So it really matters what the board does, and if people in the organisation do know more about the board, that's helpful, because they can see whether or not they would trust the board to do the right thing, and I think that matters too.
But if you flip that, then wouldn't it really matter that people on the board have met people on the front line? I mean, how do they know what the reality is out there?
Yes, it would. And yes, it happens. I mean, our next people committee is going to be held in the Edinburgh office, and we are going to be meeting staff. But what you've got on a board often is non-exec directors, and they are non-executive directors are ones who don't work full-time in the organisation, and so there is a limit to how much time they might spend with frontline staff. But it's still really important that you do find out about staff and about customers and so on. So when I was on the HMRC board, one of the things that we did was listen to customer call-ins to see how they were handled. So if you'd rung up about your tax for some reason, we would listen. Now, you have to be a bit cautious because your tax affairs are very private. So, you know, we had to, if we listened to that, we used the general sense of it in our understanding of how to advise the civil servants who run the HMRC. But we couldn't talk about what we'd heard, obviously, because it was somebody's tax business. But it was fascinating to hear both the issues that customers had and the way in which the very competent, very able tax advisors on the end of the line were advising people.
Well, I think you're creeping up on what is a classic big problem in business and in the nonprofit sector, which is that the board doesn't actually know what's going on, right? And so what the story you just told is the board trying to get a sense of what's really going on. And I can remember when Paul Preston, then chief exec for most of Europe for McDonald's, was telling me, and I assume they still do this, though this was some time ago, that once a year, all the senior executive team had to spend a full day working in a McDonald's store, right? They had to be out there handing out the burgers, doing the thing, so that they got a sense of the reality of their business. Have you any other stories of boards that have taken it that seriously, that they're actually connecting at the front? And how does a board ensure it's got the information it needs?
So those are kind of two separate questions in a way. So the senior executive team are the ones that work full-time in the business and actually run the business. They deliver on the purpose, the strategy of the organization. The board may have some of those senior executives on it. A charity board, for instance, is unlikely to have any of those senior executives on it. It is likely to be comprised mostly of non-executives, because trustees on a charity board are not paid, generally speaking, but senior executives in a charity are paid. And you can't pay your board members unless you get permission from the charity. There's a lot of stuff around paying your board members. So, so when you're looking at a board, what you're looking at is who's on the board in terms of non-executives and executives. And quite often the chief executive in an organization is on the board, perhaps the chief financial officer. There may be other chief officers of some description on a board, but not the whole senior management team, generally speaking. There will be an executive board that does comprise that senior management team.
And so how do any of those boards get the information they need to really understand what's going on?
Well, so the information that the non-executives on the board get is mostly mediated through the executives who come to the board to present their information. And the board's job, the non-executive's job on the board, is to ask good, probing, challenging questions to make sure that we understand what we're being told, and that we are assured by what we are being told. Now, if you get a board that's probably dysfunctional in some way, then there may be a lack of trust between the executives and the non-executives, at which point all sorts of things start to go wrong, because you do have to be able to trust that your executives are doing a good job, but not to the extent that you just accept some kind of reassurance from them. Oh, it's fine. It's all, you know, we've got it in hand. It's working well and it's fine. You want assurance, not reassurance. Reassurance is there, dear, go away, we don't ask silly questions. And assurance is, yep, we're doing it, and here's the management information to prove or to demonstrate that we are getting better at managing a backlog of the cases that we're dealing with, or we're you know, or with our indicators are green, for instance. You often get management information and it's there's a what's called a RAG rating status, which is red, amber, green, like traffic lights. If it's green, it's good. If it's red, it's not good. And so that's the kind of way that you find out what's going on. Plus, you go and listen to customer call centres if you've got them. You go talk to frontline staff, maybe drop in on a team meeting or something. Let them ask you questions, because a lot of the time then you hear what's going on. You can often, depending on the nature of the IT systems that you're dealing with, you can get the staff digest, the weekly digest for staff. You can get the, you can join things. So you need to be able to do that. If you don't have sufficient time to do that as a non-executive, then you probably shouldn't be doing that job.
That does sound time consuming. And would a board set standards? Would a board be saying to its members, unless you can do some of the things you've just listed, we don't want you? They
might do. There are standards, but they're often about behaviour. But that's about, they do talk about, I mean, particularly at recruitment time, there are checks and balances on, can you actually commit the time that you need to commit? And if you're savvy, when you're looking at an application pack for a job as a non-executive, you will look at the time commitment that they say in there, and you'll double it and go, can I do that properly?
Right, that makes sense. You're obviously very clear on what a high performance board looks like, what it's doing. So what goes wrong? Because we see time and time again, all you have to do is read the news, boards that seem to have failed, either intentionally or not. What are, from your experience, what are the most frequently encountered problems that most boards would face?
So I think a lot of this has to do with, does the organisation get the data it needs to start with to be able to manage its business? Is it looking at the right things? And then is it able effectively to analyse that and turn it into good evidence? And then is that evidence communicated to the board? And there's a whole load. So firstly, they might not be collecting the right data. Secondly, there might be a load of data, but they're not actually looking at it in creative, curious ways that will enable good evidence to come out of it. There can be all sorts of biases when you're analysing data. You can assume that it's likely to be this. So when you look at the data, you can interpret it that way. So you're confirming your biases, if you like. Or maybe once the analysis has been done and you've got evidence, maybe that evidence isn't considered to be critical enough to send to the board. And maybe actually there is an issue of trust between the board and the executive. Or it could be that the executive thinks the board doesn't need to know, I mean, genuinely believes the board doesn't need to know something. So there's a whole raft of reasons why the right information, the right evidence does not reach the board. So the board's decision-making capability is distinctly reduced by that.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. But we also see, I mean, I've been on boards myself where there seem to be endless committees. And so you end up as a board member spending time on this committee and that committee and that committee. And it feels like it's just a ritual in terms of meeting your legal obligations as an institution, endlessly filling in forms for various governments and so on. How do you navigate your way through the committee epidemic experience?
Right. Well, your committees, there are some committees that some companies have to have.
Oh, of course.
Some basics. Some, generally speaking, audit and risk, remuneration, nominations. Those committees tend to be thou shalt, although you don't have to do it under those headings. So, for instance, nominations and was part of the people committee that I chaired at HMRC, and nominations and remuneration are part of the people committee at the FCA. So you can do it differently, you can shape differently, as long as you cover the things that are required by either by legislation or regulation or just by good practice. And then any other committees that you have should be supporting your strategy and your purpose. They should not be proliferating for proliferation's sake. So it depends what your organisation needs, and your committee structure should support that. And yes, that's a stage. So that's a stage often. A committee is a stage where the non-execs on it can drill down further in order to find out more. But the one thing that it's really important to remember, and there's a great saying, I don't know who invented it, but bless them, because it's really helpful, which is, as a non-exec, you should be noses in and fingers out, which means you sniff out the problems, but it's not your job to fix them, and you shouldn't be diving down rabbit holes in meetings going, yes, but what about this figure on the left-hand side that's, it's 0.1 of a million more than that figure, and really we need to look into that and do something about that. That's not your job. Your job is to say the trend's not looking great. What are you doing about it? It's to say, what are the unintended consequences of making that decision and going down that path? Should we be looking more at this risk than that risk? That's your job. It's kind of to prompt the thinking and maybe course correct if things are not going according to plan.
Well, it's not the most elegant analogy I've ever heard, but yes, it does make a lot of sense. And so I want to switch our focus, actually, because it's very interesting to me that you're now chairing a university.
Mm-hmm.
In the midst of there must be enormous complexity. Are you going to get enough students from overseas? And wow, should they come from China? And. So what were your biggest kind of surprises, I guess, when you took on that role?
I think my biggest surprise was, given that I hadn't worked in the HE sector, I'd been on an advisory board at York, actually, on their management school advisory board. So I knew a bit about what went on, and obviously I was a student several times over, so I knew a bit about that. And in general, I know a bit about academia, but I hadn't actually been immersed in the HE sector. And the first thing that surprised me, I think, was the somewhat dire state of funding, and at the moment, the way everything has come together, So government rhetoric about immigration, for instance, the cap on student fees, so that actually we're losing money on home students, the erroneous concept that our international students are pushing our home students out. So, you know, we take fewer home students because we want to make loads of money from international students. And the kind of I don't think I ever thought that universities were wealthy places. Obviously, there are a couple of universities in the UK that are pretty wealthy, but they've been around for a very, very long time. And I don't think I had that illusion about most universities, but that seems to be part of the public perception about universities, and also the notion that we deliver degrees that aren't worth delivering. So what the government chooses to call Mickey Mouse degrees.
Yes.
And none of those illusions are founded in good evidence.
Which is your polite way of saying they're not true. Okay, I got you. But also, as I listen to you talk about Mickey Mouse, I'm thinking he's generated hundreds of millions of dollars, has Mickey Mouse.
Well, actually, that's true. I hadn't really thought about that. That's a very interesting way of putting it.
But there is this assumption, I guess, that's perfectly clear, that you're talking about elite institutions. And so naturally, you don't expect elite institutions to be hard up for cash. But clearly they are. So what is the role of your role as chair in the midst of the context you've just described? What is your job?
Our job is to make sure that the organisation is right. It's exactly the same as other board jobs. It's to make sure that organisations are run properly, to look at the risk, to work with the executive team, to help them think through some of the risks, some of the consequences of decisions, some of the assumptions that are made in forecasting, because obviously boards need to forecast what they are, or the money that's going to come in. And that can be very difficult because actually with, for instance, international students, you only actually know how many you're really going to have when they arrive on your doorstep. So even if you've got a number of acceptances, and it's the same is true for home students, but less so because it's less of a big trip, as it were. So it's a bit tricky to make those kinds of predictions, but you have to, because you don't know how much you can spend unless you know how much you're going to get in.
And yet when you say things like this Mickey Mouse, this perception that you're offering Mickey Mouse degrees isn't true, are you expected in your role as chair to go public with that message, as you in a way are now?
I can do. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's somebody else's job to do that. And that's the most appropriate way to deal with it. It's always the chair's job, in my view, if there is a real reputational issue, it's always the chair's job to step up and, if appropriate, defend the organisation. It's not always appropriate.
Would you be actively, personally involved as chair in conversations with the government departments that are responsible for the policies that have a direct impact on your university?
Not in our case at York at the moment, but then I'm very new in the HE sector. So that may be part of it. I might have more conversations when I become more familiar with some of the complex issues, because many ministers will have very set views and be inclined to defend them to the hilt. And it can be difficult for someone who is not steeped in a sector to challenge those. People who are not steeped in a particular sector bring a different skill, because it's about going, well, why don't we do that here? You know, they do that somewhere else. Why don't we do that here? So it's like an outside new lens, but when it comes to in-depth discussions about something, you may not be quite as useful.
Well, and as you say, the complexity of the higher education system is such, in terms of the funding streams and the way it really operates, that the minister will have next to him a civil servant who's got it all absolutely crystal clear in his mind.
Yeah. So when I chaired Scope, because I was much more familiar with the environment, I did have some discussions with some ministers. But again, it depends, because so for instance, when I chaired Scope, you always balance with your chief exec. As the chair of an organisation, you work with your chief exec to go, well, what are you going to be best at doing publicly? And what am I going to be best at doing publicly? That's where my red line about if it's a reputational damage issue, it's always the chair. It should be. It isn't, actually. If you look at what happens when people get reputational damage issues, it isn't necessarily the chair that steps up and goes, okay, maybe that was wrong, or it wasn't wrong, or I defend my chief exec to the hilt, or whatever. Often doesn't happen. But so one of the things that I couldn't do, and that was in the days before much was online, because we weren't very good at that, and the BBC insisted on ISDN lines for telephone calls even. I couldn't be up at 6 o'clock in the morning to be on the red sofa at breakfast and defend something or speak about something. That had to be my chief exec.
Right.
And it's the same in a way. So my vice chancellor at York is extremely competent, extremely well versed in the HE sector, and he does the stuff with the ministers and so on.
And that works. That's just a pragmatic way of
that is a pragmatic
the
way
job
of
gets
dealing
done.
with it.
Absolutely.
And that's really important, because it depends on the nature of the specific chair and the specific chief exec or vice chancellor or whatever. So you have to work together to go, what am I best at? What am I bringing? And what are you bringing? And there are some things, obviously, where it's my job or it's his job or her job. But where it comes to things like public face, it is much more about, okay, how do we divide this up between us?
While ensuring that ultimately the university delivers its main purpose, which is the education of the students.
Yes.
It's bizarre that somehow doesn't seem to enter into the public discourse as often as it should.
It definitely enters into the board's discourse, though. So.
Well, that's good to hear. And so that's really interesting. As a Canadian, I have no experience of the UK's university system directly, but I can just imagine what you're navigating there. So as we're coming to the close of our conversation, of course, when I've got someone who is has so much experience with such a wide range of institutions, asking the big questions that actually make sure they deliver their promise, what is your advice? If you had some board people listening to this podcast, what are the top 3, the top 2 bits of advice that you've got that you would say, whatever you do, always do this and never do that? Yeah, I'd like to hear your never do that's as well.
So I think my never do that is never dive down into the depths of the organisation. Actually, see, I'm not very good at nevers, because now I've
except of course when you don't. You're thinking, but what if we don't have the information we need? Yeah.
Yeah, well, you should always question yourself whether you've got the information you need, and not, because particularly where boards are have people on them who have had a long and very distinguished executive career and who are used to delivering, driving, knowing it all, being being having the full vista of their department or whatever it is, and understanding how that works in depth, to move back and say that's not my job anymore. My job is very different. The job of an executive and a non-executive is very, very different. And so almost never dive into the depths of the organization would be what I would say. And if you do need to, there is a problem. There is dysfunction somewhere. So that would be a never. And always would be, always ask yourselves as an individual on the board and as a board as a whole, always ask yourself, how well are we doing? Are we doing our job? What are we doing that is not necessary? What are we not doing that we should be doing? And always evaluate yourselves at least once a year against some criteria that you can do something about and you're prepared to do something about. And always look at the behaviours that you are modelling, because you as a board are modelling the behaviours for the rest of the organisation. So if you go into the reception area and you're grumpy and you know, you've had a bad morning so far and you've come in and you didn't really want to be there and you're rude to the reception staff, that is modelling a behaviour.
It certainly is.
That you don't really want replicated throughout the organisation. So always think, always question, always go, what am I doing? What is my role in this? If something goes wrong, what was my role in the something that went wrong? What was our board's role in the something that went wrong? What did we not do that we should have been doing?
Well, in a world where we're all pushed to act and act and act and jump to the next meeting, the level of self-reflection that you're talking about is both rare and precious. So that's a very, very positive and sensible place for us to say thank you very much.
Thank you
and
very
I look
much.
forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
If you found this content relevant and perhaps even thought-provoking, please feel free to share with your networks.